Christa Gail Pike was born on March 10, 1976, in West Virginia, into a world already marked by instability. Her earliest years were far from secure or nurturing. From the start, she lived in a fractured family environment where consistent care and emotional safety were absent. Her father was not a steady presence in her life, and her mother, often preoccupied with her own problems, was unable to provide Christa with the stability every child needs. This lack of structure at home would set the stage for the difficulties she faced later in life. Growing up, Christa was surrounded by chaos. Accounts from people who knew her during childhood describe a girl who seemed both needy and troubled. She struggled with neglect and developed deep insecurities. Her mother reportedly struggled with addiction and was often unable to take responsibility for raising her daughter in a stable way. In such an environment, Christa had very little guidance. Instead of a safe home life, she grew up in a world where attention and affection were inconsistent, leaving her constantly searching for validation. In her early teenage years, Christa's behavior reflected the turmoil she lived with daily. She became increasingly rebellious, acting out in ways that drew negative attention. Teachers and other adults noticed her difficulties but were often unable to provide the kind of intervention she needed. Her academic life suffered, and her relationships with peers were unstable. Instead of focusing on school or building positive friendships, Christa became drawn to risky behavior. It was clear to those around her that she was carrying heavy emotional baggage, but without the right support systems, she had no outlet for her anger and confusion. Abuse also played a role in Christa's development. Reports suggest that she may have experienced physical and emotional mistreatment growing up. This added to her feelings of abandonment and insecurity. A young girl already dealing with instability at home now had to endure trauma that would influence her mental health and self-perception for years to come. These experiences would leave scars that shaped her ability, or inability, to form healthy attachments later in life. By the time Christa reached her mid-teens, the pattern was clear. She had become vulnerable to toxic relationships and destructive influences. Her need for belonging was strong, but the ways she sought it often led her down dangerous paths. Instead of seeking out supportive mentors or stable friendships, she gravitated toward people who mirrored her own instability. This tendency made her particularly susceptible to manipulation, as she longed for love and validation from almost anyone who offered it, regardless of their intentions. Christa's environment in West Virginia also added to her struggles. The economic conditions in the area were difficult, with many families facing financial hardship. Poverty and social challenges often contributed to cycles of dysfunction. For someone like Christa, who already lacked a strong family foundation, these surroundings only made her situation worse. She was growing up in a setting where opportunities were limited, and her chances of escaping her troubled environment were slim. As she transitioned from childhood into adolescence, Christa began experimenting with substances and displaying increasingly erratic behavior. Her emotional instability was noticeable, and her ability to control her impulses was weak. Those who knew her recall that she could shift quickly from seeking affection to displaying anger or aggression. This volatility made it difficult for her to maintain steady relationships with peers, teachers, or family members. She was a teenager caught between a desperate need for love and an inability to manage her emotions in a healthy way. The troubled foundation of Christa's early life set the stage for what would come later. Without stability, guidance, or consistent care, she was left to navigate her teenage years largely on her own. The neglect she experienced, combined with possible abuse and ongoing instability, created a young person who was emotionally fragile and prone to poor decision-making. Instead of building resilience and healthy coping mechanisms, Christa entered adolescence burdened by unresolved trauma and desperate for connection at any cost. In later years, experts who examined her case pointed out how critical her early environment had been in shaping her path. They noted that while many young people experience hardship, Christa's particular combination of neglect, abuse, and lack of stability created a dangerous vulnerability. She did not have the tools to manage her emotions or the guidance to direct her need for attention into positive outlets. This foundation would make her especially susceptible when she later encountered toxic influences, particularly in her romantic relationships. Christa's troubled childhood also highlighted how systems often fail young people in need. There were opportunities where intervention might have made a difference, whether through school counseling, community support, or mental health resources, but these did not come in time or with enough consistency to alter her trajectory. The combination of personal vulnerability and environmental failure left her isolated and searching for belonging in all the wrong places. By the time Christa left her childhood years behind, she was already on a path marked by instability. She had the emotional scars of neglect, the insecurity of someone who had never known consistent love, and the growing tendency to attach herself to unhealthy relationships. This mix of psychological and social factors would play a central role in the choices she later made as a young adult. Her story demonstrates how a fractured childhood can echo far into the future. Christa Pike's life in West Virginia was the first chapter of a tragic narrative. The instability, neglect, and abuse she endured shaped her vulnerabilities, making her more likely to seek out dangerous attachments and destructive behaviors. These early experiences would not excuse her later actions, but they provided the backdrop against which her life, and her crimes, would unfold. When Christa Pike left West Virginia and moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, her life did not stabilize in the way one might have hoped. Instead, her new surroundings only deepened the turbulence already growing inside her. At just 18 years old, she entered the JobCorps program, a government initiative designed to help at-risk youth gain education and job training. The program, based in Knoxville, brought together teenagers and young adults from troubled homes, many of them carrying their own histories of neglect, abuse, or criminal behavior. For someone like Christa, who was already unstable and craving attention, the environment was both an opportunity and a dangerous trap. It was here that Christa Pike met Tadderell Shipp, a 17-year-old with his own troubled past. What started as a teenage romance quickly transformed into something far more complicated and destructive. Christa, who had always struggled with feelings of abandonment and insecurity, saw in Tadderell not just a boyfriend but a lifeline. She clung to him with a desperation that blurred the line between affection and obsession. For her, Tadderell represented loyalty and companionship that she had long been denied, but the intensity of her need made the relationship unstable from the start. Tadderell Shipp, on the other hand, was not a grounding influence. He was deeply involved in dark interests, including the occult and a fascination with Satanism. He was not the stabilizing figure Christa needed, rather, he amplified her instability. Their relationship was fueled not by healthy love but by a mix of obsession, toxic dependency, and shared rebelliousness. Together, they fed off one another's weaknesses, creating a cycle where jealousy, anger, and loyalty became blurred into destructive patterns. Within the JobCorps environment, Christa and Tadderell surrounded themselves with a small group of equally troubled peers. Many of the students at JobCorps were searching for belonging, and in that search, cliques formed. Christa and Tadderell became central figures in one of these groups, one where rebellious behavior, aggression, and fascination with violence were common themes. It was not uncommon for Christa to openly talk about dark ideas or lash out against people she disliked. Instead of being challenged or redirected, she found affirmation in peers who shared her anger or at least entertained it. This environment was critical in shaping what was to come. In many ways, Christa was a teenager desperate for validation. Her relationship with Tadderell magnified this need. Whenever she feared losing him or sensed disloyalty from others, her reactions became extreme. Tadderell, rather than discouraging this behavior, reinforced it. Their connection thrived on the intensity of their emotions, whether it was love, anger, or jealousy. For them, conflict seemed to fuel passion, and soon, the line between emotional turbulence and violent action began to thin. Observers at JobCorps noted that Christa became increasingly possessive and territorial. Her jealousy toward other girls was intense, particularly toward Colleen Slemmer, another young woman in the program. Colleen was described as kind but somewhat naive, and though there is little evidence that Colleen sought conflict with Christa, Christa perceived her as a threat. Whether Colleen had shown interest in Tadderell or Christa simply imagined it, the result was the same: Colleen became a target of Christa's jealousy and resentment. As her relationship with Tatterall deepened, Christa's worldview darkened. She often discussed occult practices and leaned into Tatterall's fascination with Satanism. What might have been teenage posturing or rebellion for some became, for Christa, a framework to justify violent thoughts. Her obsession with power, control, and loyalty began to manifest in conversations about hurting others, especially those she believed threatened her relationship. Within her circle, such talk was not always dismissed. At times, it was encouraged or even admired. The bond between Christa and Tatterall became inseparable from these destructive influences. They weren't merely two troubled teenagers in love, they were reinforcing one another's darkest impulses. Tatterall provided Christa with validation, and Christa provided Tatterall with someone willing to act on dangerous fantasies. Their connection was no longer about companionship or support, it became a dangerous partnership where obsession was mistaken for love and loyalty was tested through destructive ideas. This dangerous combination meant that Christa's inner turmoil had an outlet, and her desire for control over her relationship with Tatterall escalated into actions that would soon have devastating consequences. The relationship became less about two young people finding comfort in each other and more about a pact of obsession, jealousy, and violence. For Christa, proving her devotion meant being willing to do whatever it took to protect their bond, even if it involved hurting others. For Tatterall, it meant going along with Christa's escalating plans, blurring his own boundaries between influence and complicity. The JobCorps environment failed to intervene. Staff and other students noticed the intense relationship and Christa's increasingly erratic behavior, but nothing substantial was done to redirect or address the situation. In an environment already filled with troubled youth, Christa's issues did not stand out as unique. What seemed like teenage drama or rivalry was, in reality, a volatile mixture of obsession, jealousy, and violence brewing just beneath the surface. By the end of her first months in Knoxville, Christa's life had taken a sharp turn away from any possibility of stability. Instead of finding education, growth, or direction at JobCorps, she found validation for her darkest impulses and a partner whose influence drove her deeper into obsession. Her relationship with Tatterall Shipp was not just a teenage romance, it was the beginning of a deadly alliance. What started as love quickly evolved into a dangerous obsession, one that would set the stage for a murder that shocked Tennessee and left lasting scars on everyone involved. Christa Pike's story cannot be understood without this chapter in her life. The move to Knoxville, the toxic bond with Tatterall, and the reinforcement of violent ideas created the conditions for tragedy. This was not simply the story of a troubled girl, it was the story of how love, when twisted by obsession and surrounded by dangerous influences, became a weapon. The seeds of violence had been planted, and soon they would grow into an act that made Christa the youngest woman on death row in modern American history. When Christa Pike enrolled at the Knoxville JobCorps program in 1994, her life already carried the weight of instability and emotional scars. It was meant to be a place of structure and opportunity, a federally funded training program where young people from difficult backgrounds could learn vocational skills and prepare for adulthood. For Christa, however, the program became less about rebuilding her life and more about entangling herself in unhealthy relationships that fueled her darkest impulses. At the center of this downward spiral stood another young woman, Colleen Slemmer. Colleen Slemmer, only 19 years old, had joined the JobCorps with similar hopes of building a better future. Described by her friends and instructors as kind, cheerful, and ambitious, Colleen stood out for her openness and ability to connect with people. She had her own personal struggles, but compared to Christa, her life had a sense of direction. This difference made her an unintentional target of Christa's insecurities. The tension between the two young women began subtly, yet it grew rapidly into something dangerous. The JobCorps program was designed to provide young men and women with job training in an isolated, structured environment, but within its dorms and classrooms, cliques often formed. Christa had already developed a reputation among fellow students for being erratic and prone to emotional outbursts. Her relationship with Tatterall Shipp, a fellow JobCorps student, became the center of her world. Tatterall was 2 years older, and their romance was intense, obsessive, and often volatile. To Christa, Tatterall was more than just a boyfriend, he was the anchor she clung to, the person she believed validated her existence. That dependency quickly fed into jealousy when she perceived threats to their bond. It was not long before Christa became convinced that Colleen was interested in Tatterall. Whether this suspicion had any basis in truth or was entirely a creation of Christa's mind remains uncertain. Colleen herself did not show any notable signs of pursuing Tatterall, and those who knew her described her interactions as friendly, not flirtatious. But for Christa, whose troubled childhood had already left her with deep insecurities, the mere idea of another girl being close to Tatterall was intolerable. Her thoughts spiraled into paranoia, and Colleen became a rival in Christa's eyes. Christa's jealousy wasn't subtle. She confronted Colleen multiple times in front of others, making accusations and demanding that she stay away from Tatterall. These interactions created an environment of fear and unease for Colleen, who reportedly told friends she felt harassed and didn't know how to make the situation stop. Other students noticed Christa's behavior and some even commented that her fixation on Colleen was unhealthy. But within the insular world of the JobCorps, where young people were left to sort out their conflicts with limited supervision, the rivalry was allowed to escalate unchecked. As weeks passed, Christa's obsession grew darker. She began to express hatred toward Colleen openly, venting to Tatterall and others that she wanted to see her rival gone. What started as jealous suspicion transformed into a fixation that Colleen was a genuine threat to her relationship and her identity. Christa's sense of belonging at the JobCorps had been fragile, tied almost entirely to Tatterall's attention. Losing him, whether real or imagined, was something she could not bear. And so, the idea of eliminating Colleen began to form in her mind. There were also other influences that shaped Christa's mindset during this period. Within the JobCorps, she and Tatterall associated with a small group of students who shared an interest in the occult and dark symbolism. Christa, already fascinated by witchcraft and the idea of satanic rituals, projected this imagery onto her growing resentment. She spoke about Colleen as though her removal was not just personal but somehow tied to power, control, and the approval of Tatterall. The blending of jealousy with occult obsession created a volatile mix, blurring reality and feeding Christa's belief that violence could solve her problems. Colleen, meanwhile, continued her training at the JobCorps, trying to ignore the hostility but becoming increasingly aware of the danger. Accounts later revealed that she had confided in her boyfriend outside the program about the tensions with Christa. She seemed to sense that things were escalating beyond typical teenage rivalry. But even then, Colleen likely could not have predicted the depth of Christa's anger or the lengths she was willing to go. The environment at the JobCorps also played a role in intensifying the rivalry. The students lived in close quarters, with little privacy and constant interaction. Any perceived slight or confrontation was magnified. For Christa, every time she saw Colleen, it was another reminder of the insecurity she felt about Tatterall. The pressure cooker atmosphere of the program allowed her resentment to fester and deepen. Small incidents, eye contact, casual conversations, laughter between Colleen and Tatterall, took on exaggerated meanings in Christa's mind. By the beginning of 1995, the hostility had reached a breaking point. Christa was no longer content with verbal confrontations or threats. She began voicing more violent intentions, telling those close to her that Colleen needed to be dealt with. Some dismissed her words as empty outbursts, a reflection of her temper and dramatic personality. But for Christa, the thoughts were becoming concrete plans. In her distorted perspective, eliminating Colleen was the only way to protect her relationship and solidify her standing with Tatterall. This toxic mixture of jealousy, obsession, and a desperate need for control set the stage for tragedy. The rivalry between Christa Pike and Colleen Slemmer was not merely a clash of personalities, it was the beginning of a deadly fixation that would soon spiral into shocking violence. Christa's unresolved pain from her past, her dependence on Tatterall, and her immersion in dark influences all converged on one target, Colleen. And as the tension reached its peak, what had begun as a teenage conflict was about to turn into a crime that would horrify the nation. On the evening of January 12, 1995, Knoxville, Tennessee, experienced an ordinary winter night. But for 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer, it would be the last evening of her life. What unfolded that night was not a sudden burst of violence, but a carefully orchestrated attack carried out by Christa Pike, aided by her boyfriend Tadderell Shipp, and another student, Shadala Peterson. The murder was the culmination of weeks of paranoia, jealousy, and obsession that had built up within Christa, and the details of that night shocked both the local community and, later, the nation. Colleen, like many others at the JobCorps program in Knoxville, was there to create a future for herself. She had enrolled to gain skills and stability, but unknowingly, she had stepped into the path of someone who viewed her not as a peer, but as a rival. Christa Pike had convinced herself that Colleen wanted to steal her boyfriend, Tadderell. Whether this was grounded in truth or pure delusion didn't matter. To Christa, it was enough to justify what she was planning. That night, Christa told Colleen that they should meet to settle their differences. She pretended that she wanted to clear the air and make peace. The suggestion appeared friendly on the surface, and Colleen, perhaps hopeful that the constant tension could be resolved, agreed to go along. Unbeknownst to her, the meeting was a trap. Christa's real intention was not reconciliation, it was elimination. The group, Christa, Tadderell, Shadala, and Colleen, set off toward a wooded area near the University of Tennessee agricultural campus. It was a secluded spot, chosen deliberately for its isolation. The walk itself was long enough for Colleen to notice something was wrong, but she had no reason to suspect that her companions would turn on her so violently. When they arrived in the woods, the atmosphere shifted. What had begun as a walk to talk things out quickly turned into a terrifying ambush. Christa confronted Colleen about her supposed interest in Tadderell. Colleen denied the accusation, insisting she had no interest in him. But Christa wasn't listening, her mind was already set. The accusations escalated into physical aggression. What followed was not a quick act of violence, but a prolonged assault. Witnesses later recounted that Christa initiated the attack by pushing and hitting Colleen. Tadderell joined in, following Christa's lead, and soon the beating became more brutal. Colleen was overpowered, beaten repeatedly, and dragged across the ground. Christa, at just 18 years old, displayed a level of cruelty that stunned investigators later. She wasn't content with simply injuring Colleen. She wanted to humiliate and torture her. As Colleen begged for her life, Christa mocked her. Shadala, though present, took on the role of an observer, not directly involved in the killing but also not stopping it. The beating escalated into acts of torture. Colleen was slashed with a box cutter, leaving deep wounds on her body. Christa burned Colleen's skin with a lit cigarette, deliberately marking her in a display of domination. At one point, Colleen reportedly pleaded for her life, saying she just wanted to go home. But her cries only seemed to fuel Christa's rage. The attack dragged on for approximately 30 minutes, turning the forest clearing into a scene of horror. Colleen's resistance grew weaker as the group's violence intensified. Eventually, Christa delivered the fatal blows. Using a large chunk of asphalt, she crushed Colleen's skull. For Christa, it wasn't enough to kill, she wanted to leave a lasting symbol of her control and hatred. Investigators would later find a pentagram carved into Colleen's chest, etched by Christa after death. When the assault was over, the three left Colleen's body in the woods. They made no serious attempt to conceal the crime. The brutality of the killing, combined with the arrogance of leaving obvious evidence behind, suggested that Christa either believed she wouldn't be caught or didn't care about the consequences. In the aftermath, Christa's behavior revealed chilling indifference. Instead of showing fear or remorse, she boasted about what she had done. She carried a piece of Colleen's skull as a trophy and showed it to others, bragging about her role in the murder. This act would later become a critical piece of evidence against her, highlighting both her participation and her lack of remorse. The crime scene, when discovered, left investigators horrified. Colleen's body showed signs not only of murder but of prolonged torture. The brutality, the cigarette burns, the carvings, and the crushing head injury painted a picture of a killing motivated not by necessity but by sadistic intent. For law enforcement, piecing together what had happened on the night of January 12 wasn't difficult. Christa herself had already begun to talk too much. She confided in others about the murder, often with disturbing pride. Her openness about the crime would soon unravel any chance of escaping accountability. The murder of Colleen Slemmer was more than a tragic death of a young woman, it was an eruption of jealousy, obsession, and cruelty that could not be explained away as a momentary lapse. The night of January 12 laid bare Christa Pike's capacity for violence and marked the beginning of a legal battle that would bring her name into national headlines. For investigators, the details of that night would serve as the foundation for their case. The brutality, the physical evidence, and the confessions all pointed to one conclusion: Colleen's death was not an accident, nor was it the result of a fight gone wrong. It was premeditated murder, carried out with chilling intent. By the time dawn came on January 13, Colleen Slemmer's life had ended in a wooded clearing in Knoxville. And Christa Pike's path toward becoming the youngest woman on death row in the United States had begun. On the morning of January 13, 1995, a passerby walking near the woods of Tyson Park in Knoxville stumbled upon a gruesome sight. Lying on the frozen ground was the badly beaten body of a young woman. Her face and head were disfigured from repeated blunt force trauma, her chest bore stab wounds, and the scene was littered with signs of violence. What investigators would soon confirm was that the victim was 17-year-old Colleen Slemmer. The brutality shocked even seasoned detectives. This was not a quick killing, it had been drawn out, calculated, and cruel. The Knoxville Police Department immediately secured the area and began the painstaking process of collecting evidence. Investigators documented the body's position, the blood patterns, and nearby footprints. It was clear from the state of the scene that Colleen had been attacked by more than one person. The medical examiner, after an initial review, indicated that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck repeatedly by a heavy object, and multiple stab wounds. Defensive wounds on Colleen's arms and hands revealed she had fought desperately for her life. From the outset, detectives understood this was not the work of a stranger. The savagery suggested personal motives, anger, jealousy, or betrayal. Their first task was to identify the victim, and soon, Colleen's absence at the JobCorps center was reported. Staff confirmed she had not returned the previous night, and her description matched the body discovered. The case had escalated into a homicide investigation within hours. Witness accounts and leads. Back at the JobCorps center, detectives began interviewing students. Word spread quickly that Colleen had been found dead, and soon, whispers turned into pointed accusations. Multiple students recalled tension between Christa Pike and Colleen. Others mentioned hearing Christa threaten Colleen, saying she wanted to get rid of her. It didn't take long before investigators had a clear picture of growing hostility between the two girls, fueled by Christa's jealousy and obsession over Tatterallship. Witnesses told police that on the evening of January 12, Christa, Tatterall, and their friend Shadala Peterson were seen walking with Colleen, leading her away from campus toward the nearby woods. Some students had even noticed Christa trying to convince Colleen to come along earlier that day, despite Colleen's reluctance. These statements placed the suspects directly with the victim on the night of the murder. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. The evidence trail. While witness accounts painted a damning picture, physical evidence cemented the case. At the crime scene, investigators recovered blood-stained rocks and a piece of rope, believed to have been used during the assault. Shoe prints near the body were photographed and preserved. Forensic teams noted that one of the shoe print patterns resembled footwear known to be worn by Tatterall. But what truly accelerated the investigation was Christa's own behavior in the hours following the murder. Instead of showing fear or remorse, she bragged openly to fellow students. Several witnesses told detectives that Christa had laughed about what she had done and even produced a chilling souvenir, a fragment of Colleen's skull, which she carried in her pocket and showed off to others. Some students dismissed it as an outrageous claim at first, but when police later recovered the bone fragment from Christa, the horror of her actions became undeniable. This bizarre need to flaunt her crime left investigators stunned. Christa had not only committed a vicious murder but had also ensured she would leave a trail straight back to herself. Rapid breakthrough. By the weekend, detectives had enough evidence to move in. On January 15, 1995, just 3 days after the murder, police arrested Christa Pike, Tatterall Shipp, and Shadala Peterson. The arrests came swiftly, shocking both the JobCorps community and Knoxville residents. The fact that teenagers were responsible for such a barbaric act made headlines nationwide. During questioning, Shadala quickly distanced herself, insisting she had not participated in the killing. She admitted to being present when Colleen was lured to the woods but claimed she left before the violence escalated. Her testimony would later provide prosecutors with a clearer timeline of the events that unfolded that night. Christa, however, displayed a chilling lack of remorse. Reports from investigators described her demeanor as smug and detached. Instead of expressing fear about being arrested for murder, she seemed more annoyed at being caught. Detectives noted that her obsession with Tatterall was evident even during interrogation. She spoke about him protectively, as though their love justified everything. Tatterall, only 17 at the time, was quieter. While he admitted to being there, his statements tried to minimize his role, pointing back to Christa as the driving force behind the murder. Still, it was clear that both he and Christa had taken active part in the killing. The shockwave in Knoxville. As details of the case emerged, Knoxville was horrified. The idea that a teenager, a young woman not even out of her teens, could commit such savagery disturbed the community. Parents of other JobCorps students demanded answers. How could a federally funded program meant to rehabilitate and educate troubled youth have become the backdrop for such violence? Media coverage amplified the shock. Local newspapers described the murder as ritualistic, cruel, and senseless. The detail of Christa keeping a piece of the victim's skull became a headline that lingered in the public's mind. Overnight, Christa Pike's name was tied to one of the most shocking murders in Tennessee's history. Preparing for trial. With the suspects in custody, the foundation of the case was strong. Eyewitness testimony, forensic evidence, and Christa's own incriminating behavior created a damning narrative. Prosecutors would argue that Christa had been the mastermind, driven by jealousy and obsession, while Tatterall acted as her willing accomplice. Shadala, though present, would ultimately face lesser consequences as her role was peripheral. For investigators, the case was unusually swift in resolution. In less than a week, they had identified the victim, traced the suspects, and secured enough evidence for prosecution. But the deeper question remained: why had this happened at all? What had led a 19-year-old girl, who had once been described as vulnerable and troubled, to orchestrate a killing so vicious it shocked even hardened law enforcement officers? Christa's arrest marked the end of the manhunt but the beginning of an even more complex story: her trial, her defense, and the debate over whether a teenager so consumed by jealousy and violence deserved the ultimate punishment. The courtroom would soon become the stage where Christa Pike's actions were dissected in excruciating detail, and the world would see how a troubled young woman had turned into one of America's most infamous killers. The trial of Christa Pike began in 1996, only a year after the brutal killing of Colleen Slemmer. Knoxville, Tennessee, was gripped by the case, and the courtroom quickly became a stage where the nation would witness the disturbing collision of youth, violence, and obsession. The accused was not the hardened criminal one might expect, but an 18-year-old girl, petite in stature and often seen smirking or showing little remorse during proceedings. That image alone would make headlines, but what unfolded in court painted a picture even more chilling. From the opening statements, the prosecution built a damning case. Prosecutors argued that the killing of Colleen Slemmer was not a random act of violence but a calculated and sadistic murder fueled by jealousy and obsession. They introduced evidence suggesting that Christa had meticulously planned to lure Colleen to a secluded area, intending from the start to cause her pain and death. The involvement of Tatterall Shipp and Shadala Peterson was acknowledged, but Christa was positioned as the instigator and leader, the one whose personal motives had driven the crime forward. Key witnesses testified about Christa's behavior both before and after the killing. Fellow JobCorps students recounted how Christa openly expressed hatred toward Colleen, accusing her of trying to steal Tatterall. Several remembered Christa making comments about wanting to hurt or even kill Colleen in the weeks leading up to January 12, 1995. Those statements, combined with the brutality of the crime itself, helped prosecutors draw a line of premeditation that was hard for the defense to counter. But the most damning testimony came from those who described Christa's shocking pride after the murder. One student testified that Christa had shown off a piece of bone, which investigators later confirmed to be part of Colleen's skull. She treated it almost like a trophy, a grim reminder of what she had done. This detail horrified the courtroom and solidified the perception that Christa was not simply a misguided teenager but someone capable of terrifying cruelty. The prosecution also leaned heavily on forensic evidence. Investigators presented crime scene photographs and medical reports detailing Colleen's injuries. Jurors were shown how Colleen had been beaten, slashed, and ultimately killed by a large rock crushing her skull. The cruelty of the attack, coupled with evidence of torture before death, painted a portrait of sadism. When these details were read aloud, members of the jury and audience visibly recoiled. The evidence was not only overwhelming, it was deeply disturbing. On the other side, the defense faced an uphill battle. Christa's attorneys attempted to portray her as a troubled young woman with a history of mental health struggles, arguing that her age and background should be taken into account. They suggested that Christa's unstable childhood and deep emotional insecurities had made her vulnerable to obsession and poor decision-making. By painting her as immature and psychologically fragile, they hoped to shift the jury's perception from a calculated killer to a disturbed teenager who had spiraled out of control. They also pointed to the involvement of Tatterall Shipp, arguing that Christa's actions had been heavily influenced by her boyfriend and her desire to keep him close. In their telling, she was a young girl desperate for love, manipulated and swept into a crime she could not fully comprehend. But these arguments struggled to hold against the sheer weight of evidence pointing to her initiative and leadership. Witness after witness described her as the one driving the violence, not merely following along. Christa's own demeanor during the trial did little to help her defense. Reporters noted that she often appeared nonchalant, smirking or rolling her eyes as evidence was presented. At one point, she was even described as laughing, which shocked observers who expected at least a show of remorse. Whether these reactions were the product of youthful arrogance, nervousness, or true indifference, they fueled a public perception of her as cold and remorseless. The media coverage was intense. Newspapers and television stations across the country seized on the story of an 18-year-old girl accused of such brutal violence. Headlines often highlighted her age and gender, framing her as a disturbing anomaly in the world of crime. Female killers were rare enough, but teenage ones were almost unheard of. The public fascination was heightened by the gruesome details of the murder and Christa's seemingly casual attitude about it. She quickly became a national figure, not of sympathy, but of horror. The defense tried to raise the possibility of mental illness as a mitigating factor, suggesting that Christa may have suffered from borderline personality disorder or other psychological conditions that impaired her judgment. Experts were brought in to testify about her troubled upbringing, including her difficult relationship with her family and her history of instability. Yet even these arguments struggled to erase the chilling reality of her post-crime behavior. The image of Christa bragging about the murder, keeping a piece of Colleen's skull as a memento, was far more powerful than any psychological explanation offered. As the trial continued, the prosecution's narrative grew increasingly airtight. Jurors saw Christa not as a confused teenager caught in a bad situation, but as someone who had made deliberate choices driven by jealousy and a desire to dominate. They emphasized her repeated threats against Colleen before the murder, her role in luring the victim into the woods, and her leadership during the attack. All of it pointed to premeditation, malice, and a disturbing absence of empathy. Public opinion reflected the gravity of the case. Many were shocked not only by the brutality of the murder but also by the fact that someone so young could be capable of orchestrating it. Calls for severe punishment grew louder, with some arguing that Christa deserved no leniency despite her age. The case became a flashpoint for debates about juvenile crime, mental health, and the death penalty for young offenders. By the time the closing arguments were delivered, the narrative was set. The prosecution urged the jury to hold Christa fully accountable, framing her as the ringleader of a senseless and sadistic murder. The defense pleaded for consideration of her youth and troubled past, asking the jury to see her as more than the worst thing she had done. But the haunting details of Colleen Slemmer's final hours weighed heavily on everyone present. The trial of Christa Pike was more than just a legal proceeding, it was a national spectacle that forced the public to confront uncomfortable questions. Could a teenager truly be as dangerous as the most hardened criminals? Should age shield someone from the harshest punishments when the crime itself was so brutal? And what did it mean for society when someone so young could embody such darkness? Those questions lingered as the jury prepared to deliberate. What was clear, however, was that the image of Christa Pike, the teenage girl who had planned and carried out a killing with chilling pride, would remain etched in the public imagination long after the trial ended. When the jury returned to the courtroom to deliver their decision, the weight of silence was crushing. The trial of Christa Pike had already revealed shocking brutality, but the final question remained: what punishment should a 20-year-old woman receive for orchestrating one of the most sadistic murders in Knoxville's history? On March 30, 1996, the jury recommended the ultimate penalty. Christa Gail Pike was sentenced to die by electrocution, making her the youngest woman on death row in the United States. The decision stunned the courtroom. Few expected that a woman so young would face the harshest punishment the American justice system could deliver. Her sentencing became a lightning rod for national debate, raising questions about juvenile justice, gender, and whether age should protect someone from execution when the crime was exceptionally brutal. The sentencing hearing. During sentencing, prosecutors focused heavily on the savagery of Colleen Slemmer's death. They described in detail how Christa had not only participated but had driven the violence, taunting Colleen during the attack, carving into her chest, and keeping a piece of her skull as a trophy. The state argued that this was not a momentary lapse of judgment or an impulsive act of teenage aggression, it was a deliberate, calculated act of cruelty that deserved the severest consequence. The defense urged the jury to consider Christa's troubled upbringing, her mental instability, and her youth. Her attorneys painted a portrait of a girl shaped by neglect, abuse, and desperation for love and control. They pleaded for life imprisonment instead of execution, suggesting that rehabilitation was still possible for someone so young. But the gruesome details of the crime outweighed those appeals. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours before recommending death. Judge Richard Baumgartner affirmed the sentence, stating the murder met the criteria for extreme cruelty and premeditation. Christa showed little emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining the same cold, detached demeanor she had displayed throughout much of the trial. Reactions in Knoxville. The Knoxville community was deeply divided in its reaction. For Colleen Slemmer's family, the verdict was a form of justice, though it could not erase the pain of their daughter's violent death. Colleen's mother described the sentencing as some measure of peace, though she admitted nothing could truly bring closure. Others in Knoxville saw the sentence as a necessary message, that no matter your age or gender, if you committed an act of brutality, you would face the harshest punishment. To them, sparing Christa would have undermined the value of Colleen's life. But there were also voices of discomfort. Some questioned whether executing a woman barely out of her teens was just. Social workers, psychologists, and activists argued that Christa's youth should have been a mitigating factor. They pointed to research showing that adolescent brains are still developing, particularly in areas of impulse control and judgment. For them, sentencing Christa to death represented a failure of the justice system to recognize the difference between a teenager and a fully mature adult. National media coverage. News outlets across the United States seized on the story. The idea of a teenage girl sentenced to death was sensational and disturbing. Headlines emphasized her age and gender, often framing the case in stark contrasts: pretty and deadly, the youngest woman on death row, and teen killer sentenced to die. Christa's demeanor also became a focal point of coverage. In court, she was often described as smug, unemotional, and even defiant. Reports of her keeping a piece of Colleen's skull as a trophy horrified the public. To many, she was the embodiment of remorseless cruelty. Yet others noted how the media leaned heavily into stereotypes of female killers, painting her as a seductress or a femme fatale, labels rarely applied to male defendants of the same age. The trial and sentencing turned Christa into a figure of national fascination. Television documentaries, magazine features, and talk shows debated the case, often framing it as part of a larger conversation about the death penalty in America. Gender and justice. Christa's case reopened discussions about whether women were treated differently by the justice system. Historically, women convicted of murder were less likely to face death sentences compared to men, often due to perceptions of vulnerability, capacity for reform, or lingering stereotypes about femininity and motherhood. Christa's sentencing challenged that trend. Legal analysts noted that Christa's extreme cruelty and lack of remorse likely overrode any protective instincts the jury might have felt. Still, the fact that she was the only woman on Tennessee's death row at the time underscored the rarity of her situation. To some, her punishment demonstrated gender equality in its harshest form, a recognition that women, too, could be held accountable for acts of extreme violence. The emotional impact on Colleen's family. For Colleen Slemmer's family, the sentencing was bittersweet. They had endured the gruesome details of their daughter's murder laid out in public, and while the death penalty brought a sense of accountability, it could never erase the loss. Colleen's mother spoke openly about the lasting grief, describing how every holiday, every birthday, was a reminder of what had been stolen from them. Family members also expressed frustration at how Christa's age and appearance became part of the public narrative, fearing it overshadowed Colleen's memory. To them, the trial was not about Christa being young or female, it was about the cruelty inflicted on their daughter. Broader debate. In the years following Christa's sentencing, her case was often cited in debates over the death penalty. Advocates for capital punishment argued that her sentence was a necessary deterrent and a just response to unimaginable cruelty. Opponents countered that it highlighted flaws in the system, particularly when dealing with young offenders shaped by trauma and mental instability. The American public remained sharply divided. For some, Christa Pike symbolized why the death penalty was necessary. For others, she symbolized why it was irreparably flawed. When Christa Pike entered death row at the Tennessee prison for women in Nashville, she was only 20 years old. It was an environment reserved for the most dangerous female inmates in the state, and she quickly became the youngest woman on death row in the United States. Her arrival marked the beginning of a life defined by strict routines, isolation, and the shadow of an execution date that hovered over her for decades. Inside prison, Christa's youth made her stand out. Most death row inmates were far older, and many had been hardened by long criminal histories. Christa, however, was barely out of her teenage years. Correctional officers who interacted with her in those early years often described her as unpredictable, sometimes quiet and compliant, other times manipulative and hostile. Despite the prison walls, she continued to attract attention, both from the media and from those fascinated by her unusual status as the youngest woman awaiting execution in the country. Christa gave multiple interviews over the years, each one providing glimpses into her mindset. In some, she expressed remorse and admitted regret for her role in Colleen Slemmer's murder. In others, she seemed to downplay her responsibility, portraying herself as someone caught up in circumstances beyond her control. The inconsistency only fueled debate over whether she was a cold-blooded killer or a broken young woman who had never matured past her troubled teenage years. Prison records revealed that Christa's time behind bars was far from uneventful. She frequently clashed with staff and inmates alike. Her temper, the same impulsive streak that had once led her into violence outside prison, continued to show itself within the prison walls. Over time, this volatility would culminate in one of the most notorious incidents of her incarceration. In 2001, Christa attempted to murder a fellow inmate, Patricia Jones. The attack was brutal and deliberate. Reports stated that Christa used a sock filled with a padlock as a weapon, striking Jones repeatedly in the head. She then attempted to strangle her with a shoelace. Correctional officers intervened just in time, saving Jones's life and preventing Christa from adding another victim to her record. The incident shocked even those already familiar with Christa's violent past. It demonstrated that, despite years in confinement, her capacity for violence had not diminished. The assault earned Christa an additional conviction and increased the perception that she remained a constant danger, even behind bars. The murder attempt complicated her appeals process. Her attorneys had long argued that Christa's youth at the time of the murder, combined with her history of mental illness and trauma, should have spared her from a death sentence. They raised issues of competency and fairness, pointing out that Christa had not been an adult in any meaningful sense when she committed the crime. However, prosecutors countered that her ongoing violence behind bars, highlighted by the attack on Patricia Jones, proved that she continued to be a threat and that her sentence was justified. Christa's appeals wound their way through state and federal courts, stretching out over decades. Each time, her defense team tried to bring new evidence or arguments, while the state pushed for the execution to move forward. The legal back-and-forth exemplified the slow and often frustrating process of capital punishment in America, where years, or even decades, can pass between sentencing and the actual carrying out of an execution. Media outlets continued to cover Christa's case, periodically revisiting her story whenever new developments occurred. Documentaries, articles, and true crime programs analyzed her life and her crime, presenting her as both a symbol of youthful violence and as a case study in the broader debates about capital punishment. Her notoriety made her one of the most recognizable names on death row, especially among women. Public opinion remained deeply divided. To some, Christa was a heartless killer whose brutality in Colleen Slemmer's murder justified the ultimate punishment. They pointed to her actions, carving a pentagram into Colleen's chest, keeping a piece of her skull, as proof of her cruelty. To others, Christa represented a failure of the system, a troubled teenager who slipped through the cracks and whose execution would serve little purpose beyond vengeance. Her case became a talking point in broader conversations about whether juveniles should ever face the death penalty, particularly young women. Life in prison also showed another side of Christa. Despite her violence and notoriety, she still sought human connection. Letters from outside supporters trickled in, and Christa sometimes corresponded with people on the outside. These exchanges revealed her attempts to portray herself as misunderstood, even as she wrestled with the reality of living under a death sentence. The years passed, and Christa's place in American criminal history solidified. She was no longer just the young girl who had shocked Knoxville in 1995, she became part of the national narrative surrounding juvenile crime, capital punishment, and the treatment of women in the justice system. Her continued presence on death row stood as a reminder of a crime so brutal that it left scars on everyone who encountered it, from the victim's family to the community, and even to those who studied it years later. For Colleen Slemmer's family, the appeals and the decades of waiting represented an open wound that never healed. Each time Christa's case was revisited in court or in the media, the details of Colleen's death resurfaced. The family was forced to relive their grief, confronting not only the loss of their daughter but also the ongoing debate about whether justice had been served. As of the early 2000s and beyond, Christa Pike's name remained firmly linked to both the horrific crime she committed and the controversial punishment she received. Whether viewed as a dangerous murderer or as a tragic example of lost youth, her story endured. The 2001 attack on Patricia Jones ensured that her legacy would always be that of someone who posed a threat, even after years of incarceration. Christa Pike's life behind bars, marked by violence, appeals, and media attention, became more than just the continuation of her punishment, it became a case study in how American society deals with its most troubled young offenders. Her notoriety ensured that she would not fade into obscurity, and her legacy as the youngest woman sentenced to death in the United States remained fixed in the country's criminal history.